Rewriting Britain's History Beyond the Dark Ages. The year is 407 CE. Emperor Constantine III, with the last vestiges of Roman power, withdraws his legions from the islands of Britain. For centuries, our history books have painted a stark picture of what followed a sudden collapse, a plunge into dark ages, marked by chaos and cultural void. We've been told that civilization vanished, and the country lay prostrate, awaiting its salvation from superior invading forces. But what if this narrative so deeply ingrained is entirely rubbish? As an archaeologist, I've dedicated my life to unearthing Britain's ancient past, and what I've discovered has shattered conventional wisdom. Far from a land crushed and reborn by invaders, I found a vibrant, resilient society, forging a unique and enduring culture. The tale of Roman conquest, erasing the ancient Britons of a troubled period, saved only by the mythical King Arthur, battling hordes, simply doesn't hold up. I refuse to believe our ancient culture was so easily overwhelmed. Join me on an archaeological odyssey, a quest to uncover the undeniable truth of Britain in its earliest recorded centuries. This is the real story of Britain A.D., told not through the dusty lens of outdated texts, but through the hard evidence left by the men and women who lived on this island. The Roman footprint conquest, or collaboration. Our journey begins in a peaceful corner of Somerset, the site of one of Britain's earliest and bloodiest clashes, Cadbury Castle. For hundreds of years before the Roman arrival, this dramatic hill fort served as a vital religious center for the ancient Britons. When the legions arrived, the people were ready, their towering ramparts, once 5 meters high, prepared for defense. Yet this formidable fort was no match for the disciplined might of the Roman army. The defenders were driven back, the gates set ablaze, and Roman troops stormed through, slaughtering men, women, and children. Fields and farmlands were razed, a chilling message from Rome. The events at Cadbury Castle, a tale of tragic victims, fit perfectly into the conventional narrative of conquest. But I'm here to tell you that this version of our past is incomplete, even misleading. The first few centuries of Britain A.D. were a crucible in which our national identity was forged. Archaeology is now revealing that, far from a dark age, this was a time of immense creativity and development. The colossal shadow of Roman Britain has obscured our understanding, but by delving into the archaeological record, we can unearth the true significance of these times. At Cadbury Castle, excavators found more than just the grim evidence of a Roman massacre. They unearthed building foundations, dating to soon after the Roman occupation, confirming my suspicion. Ancient British culture was incredibly robust. And then, a fascinating twist: the archaeologists had been searching for Arthur's Camelot. The locals, in fact, had long believed this was the legendary site, unearthing ancient artifacts from their fields. Small-scale excavations revealed massive refurbishments of the fortifications, a timber-framed hall, and Mediterranean pottery, all from roughly the Arthurian period. Could Arthur himself be a clue to what truly happened in Britain A.D.? The enduring echoes of ancient beliefs. Arthurian archaeology is admittedly a field short on concrete evidence. There isn't a corner of Britain without its claim to this historical celebrity. From his conception at Tintagel to his fabled resting place in Avalon. As an archaeologist, I've always been skeptical of the Arthurian industry, seeing him as a ready-made hero hijacked by history. Yet myths are not always lies. Stripped of his medieval embellishments, Arthur offers profound insights into this period. The noble Arthur, valiantly fighting invading hordes, conflicts sharply with the conventional view of barbaric Dark Ages. Instead, he supports my belief that British culture survived the Romans largely intact. At the heart of Arthur's story, I found a powerful clue to the resilience of the native Britons, the myth of Excalibur, the sword drawn from a stone and returned to a goddess in a lake. As a prehistorian, these images sent a shiver of recognition down my spine. The image of Arthur pulling his sword from a stone eerily mirrored the ancient practice of casting bronze, where a glowing sword is quite literally pulled from a stone mold. Furthermore, my work had consistently revealed ritual traditions of disposing weapons in watery places where islands held particular potency. How did these ancient British traditions find their way into the story of King Arthur, written centuries later? The answer lies just north of the Fens, in the enigmatic Witham Valley. In 1981, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable discovery: a series of upright posts and horizontal timbers forming a raised causeway constructed over 2,000 years ago. On either side, they found dozens of pieces of ancient weaponry, including swords and spears. This wasn't a new phenomenon. Since the late 18th century, literally hundreds of swords, daggers, and other precious items had been dredged from the fens, dating from the prehistoric period right through to the 14th century. This wasn't some localized cult. It was part of a far larger, enduring belief system. These were not accidentally dropped or lost in battle. People were deliberately throwing these weapons into the water, giving them to the river. I believe the story of King Arthur receiving Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake is a direct echo of this profound, ancient British tradition. But the Arthurian legends were written long after these ancient religious ideas were supposedly wiped out by the Romans and Christianity. How on earth did they survive? Did the Witham held one more secret? This area boasts one of the highest concentrations of monastic sites in Britain. 14 abbeys scattered along a narrow 10-mile stretch of the valley. Every single one built at the end of an ancient causeway. Historians Dave Stocker and Paul Everson argue this is no coincidence. Crossing the treacherous fens by boat was dangerous, requiring offerings of folk superstition, interwoven with religion. Swords, symbols of authority, were returned to a higher power, an unearthly lord. The medieval authors of the Arthurian tales knew about these traditions because Christianity hadn't extinguished them. It had, in a sense, preserved them. The last swords were being cast into the waters as late as the 14th century, precisely when swords began being hung in churches over lords' burials. It seems even the church, often seen as stamping out paganism, absorbed these ancient practices. The common thread through all this water, the very cathedral in Lincoln, the city by the pool, derived its name from Nikkor, a water spirit. The story of the Witham is one of profound continuity, suggesting that deep-rooted ideas from prehistory persisted well into the medieval period. This contradicts the invasion narrative I learned in school, where the first 1,000 years of British history were a relentless series of conquests. It even hints that the Roman invasion itself might not have been a forceful takeover at all. Britain's true identity. A story of adaptation, not annihilation. A new wave of archaeological discoveries is beginning to fundamentally rewrite the story of the Roman invasion of Britain. Consider the elegant mosaic adorning the floor of one of Roman Britain's most luxurious buildings, Fishbourne Palace. This wasn't the residence of some extravagant Roman governor. It was the home of a wealthy Romanized Briton, the largest building ever excavated in Roman Britain. Fishbourne spans an area larger than Buckingham Palace, with hundreds of rooms and lavish mosaics. Initially, it was assumed to be a symbol of imperial oppression. But then, a gold signet ring was found, the seal of Tiberius Claudius Catuarius, a wealthy Briton. To understand why a Briton lived in a Roman palace, we must re-examine the events leading up to the AD 43 invasion. Perhaps our simplistic view of invasions shaped by 1066 is misleading. Archaeologists are now radically rethinking the Roman invasion. The notion of Britons quaking in their boots might be an oversimplification. Pre-Roman Britain was a patchwork of often feuding tribal kingdoms. Intriguing burials from before the conquest, like one near Colchester dating to 10 BC, reveal containers of Roman wine bronze work and even medallions of Emperor Augustus. Why would an Iron Age king desire a Roman emperor's head? These kings were associating themselves with Rome, much like satellite states around a powerful empire. Certain tribal leaders like Verica of the Atrebates were particularly friendly with Rome. The historian Cassius Dio describes Verica inviting the Roman troops in AD 43, suggesting not a subservient relationship, but a strategic alliance where the Romans arrived as liberators against hostile northern tribes. Can archaeology support this revolutionary idea? Dio omits the invasion's landing site, but traditional accounts place it at Richborough, Kent. However, archaeological evidence there for an early military presence is slim, relying on later topographically embellished accounts. What if the Romans landed in Chichester Harbor, right in the heart of Verica's territory? This sheltered natural harbor could accommodate a large fleet. And it's right next to Fishbourne Palace. Recent ceramic finds at Fishbourne reveal a base existed there even before the invasion, suggesting it was already a heavily Romanized place. It becomes far more likely that a large portion of the invasion force landed here in familiar territory with client kings. Verica's relative, perhaps his son Togodubnus, was likely brought in by the Romans and settled here as a client king. The marble bust of a child found at Fishbourne, undoubtedly carved in Rome, may even represent him. This contradicts the conventional narrative King Verica opened his doors, and the most splendid palace was built not as a symbol of Roman suppression, but as a celebration of British tribal power. The Romans came, saw, and conquered, but they were invited. Once here, they didn't crush our native culture. They guided the development of an increasingly diverse society. The construction of towns like Bath, with its magnificent baths and engineering stands, as a testament to Roman ingenuity. Yet the presence of offerings in the sacred spring at Bath, reminiscent of the Witham Valley traditions, suggests a continuity of ancient beliefs. The Roman buildings and sculptures, while Roman in form, often hinted at Iron Age iconography, embodying a deeper respect for the sanctity of the place. Sulis Minerva, a fusion of Roman and Iron Age goddesses, illustrates this absorption, not erasure of indigenous spirituality. The seeds of change, Christianity, and the forging of a new identity. Throughout the Roman occupation, Britain developed a unique ability to absorb foreign influences without losing its soul. But the biggest foreign influence was yet to arrive, originating not in Rome, but in the Holy Land's Christianity. This new faith would ironically contribute to the fall of the empire in Britain. A vast lead tank discovered crumpled at the bottom of a Roman well holds a clue. Why wasn't this valuable lead melted down? The tank was decorated with the Chi-Rho symbol, an early sign of Christian worship. Near this spot, in July 306, Constantine the Great was made Emperor of Rome. He later made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, sparking immense political change that foreshadowed the empire's ultimate collapse in the West. By encouraging Christianity in Britain, Constantine unknowingly gave his subjects something more powerful than Rome itself. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries, the super-rich in Britain shifted their spending from public buildings to their private country estates. These grand villas, scattered across southern Britain, show a fascinating blend of classical Roman and indigenous British elements. Mosaics, often a mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, were once dismissed as clumsy mistakes, but they offer a unique insight into the complex minds of the Romano-Britons and their evolving beliefs. At Lullingstone Roman Villa, a converted chapel was found evidence of Christian practice. Dominic Perring, studying the mosaics, found signs of Gnosticism, an unusual Christian cult. This vigorous intellectual ferment of the 4th century, focusing on escaping the mortal condition through knowledge-blended classical myths with Christian ideas of immortality. This strange fusion of beliefs, perhaps a symbol of Romano-British culture, could not be tolerated by the empire. In 380, Gnosticism was denounced as heresy, leading to the deliberate destruction of Christian items, including baptismal tanks like the one I saw. By the time this treasure was buried, Rome had lost the hearts and minds of the native Britons. Having invited the Romans in, absorbed their influences, Britain then turned its back on Rome, looking towards an independent future. The end of Roman rule. A new dawn. Not a dark age. The end of Roman administration was not a collapse, but a new beginning. 3.5 centuries after the Romans destroyed it, the magnificent hill fort of South Cadbury was reoccupied. The figure who led this resurgence has long been imagined as King Arthur. While Arthur may be a product of later Romantic historians, he embodies the emergence of petty tribal chieftains who took over after Roman power receded. This valiant king symbolizes a brave new world, where the descendants of Roman Britain began to build an independent future. Yet for centuries, we've shrouded this exciting time in mystery, labeling it the Dark Ages. Historians like Frank Stenton once wrote that between the end of Roman government and the emergence of English kingdoms, there stretched a long period of which the history cannot be written. From these empty pages, we conjured up a desolate wasteland of abandoned cities and marauding barbarians. But this is not accurate. Sophisticated societies developed in Britain during these Dark Ages. Released from Rome's rigid grip, Britain forged an independent identity. Ancient trade routes where resurrected languages evolved, and the foundations of modern European thought were laid. These were not the Dark Ages. While the fall of Rome in 410 brought political instability to Europe, with savage tribes sweeping across the continent what became of Britain on the crumbling empire's outskirts. The historical record has a gap from 410, when Rome told Britain to look to your own defenses, to 597, when Pope Gregory VII converted the Anglo-Saxons. In between only fragments and stories, a murky no-man's land perfect for myths. King Arthur, if he existed, rose to prominence in these turbulent years. But how could a period of Dark Age barbarism also produce Britain's greatest folk hero? Was Arthur invented to fill a historical void? As a prehistorian, I'm used to dealing with long periods without written records. That doesn't mean nothing happened. I'm going to find out what really happened in this mysterious time, starting where the collapse of Roman government must have been most keenly felt the cities. The resilient cities, York and Wroxeter. Underneath the medieval city walls of York, one of Roman Britain's largest centers, the earliest layers of its rich history are visible, while Roman and Viking layers are rich with archaeological evidence. The elusive Dark Age layers contain few recognizable artifacts. It's almost as if the period is invisible. However, archaeologist Mark Wyman, by re-examining thousands of pottery pieces thought to be Roman, has shed light on York's Dark Age past. With no coins for dating after the late 4th century, Wyman searched for pottery types that continued production beyond the end of Roman Britain. He found grit-tempered ware manufactured in huge quantities in East Yorkshire, proving that pottery was being made in York after the Romans left. Life in York did not come to a standstill in 410. Mark's discoveries, along with similar findings across the country, are forcing archaeologists to piece together a picture of Dark Age Britain, far different from the conventional story of collapse. It's time to start rewriting the history books. Archaeology, like all humanities, is a product of its time. Victorian archaeologists, part of a British Empire that compared itself to Rome, had every reason to suggest that when great empires collapse, disaster and chaos follow. Amidst the gentle hills of Shropshire lie the remains of the Roman town of Wroxeter. Its romantic ruins fascinated early antiquarians who saw it as an evocative reminder of a great civilization in ruin. First excavated in the 19th century, Victorian archaeologists were so excited by the Roman remains they missed something crucial that would completely rewrite the town's history. It wasn't until the 1980s that archaeologists discovered the real story of Wroxeter. Large round stones lines of packed rubble and plaster led to a realization a massive building was constructed long after the official end of Roman Britain in 410. They were dismantling earlier Roman structures to build a huge timber-framed hall laid out in Roman measurements. They were still thinking like Romans. These were not foreigners who came and left. The people in the country Romanized, they became Roman. While central administration broke down, a structure to society remained commanded by a powerful local leader, an Arthur-like character, perhaps. The discoveries at Wroxeter were a great advance, prompting archaeologists to re-examine other Roman sites in Britain to uncover what happened during the so-called Dark Ages. Hadrian's Wall. Continuity, not abandonment. Hadrian's Wall, one of Roman Britain's most important military sites, stretches from coast to coast, dotted with garrison forts. For centuries, it was believed that after the Roman army pulled out, the wall fell silent. It was even speculated that King Arthur fought his final battle of Camlan near this remote, windy spot. But recent work at Burdoswald, the westernmost fort, tells an altogether more extraordinary archaeological story. Within the fort's military headquarters, archaeologist Tony Wilmot examined the granaries. Above the stone foundations of the Roman granaries, he discovered the remains of a huge structure built long after the Roman troops withdrew an enormous wooden hall, its thatched roof the first thing one would see entering the gateway. Strange markings revealed the remains of 12 footings forming the skeleton of this immense building. This wasn't a protection racket. These were native Britons. This was home. They had to find a living. There was no mass withdrawal from Burdoswald. Tony believes there are more such forts along Hadrian's Wall. These communities didn't just disappear. If you're sitting pretty behind some high stone walls, you're not just going to disappear and start practicing subsistence farming. You're going to stay put. Burdoswald, he suggests, was one of a network of fortified centers that grew up much like reoccupied hill forts in the southwest. The old Roman frontier system had changed. To the east of Burdoswald at Craiglough, archaeologists used pollen analysis to reconstruct how the landscape changed after the Roman troops pulled out. The traditional view holds that the countryside reverted to wildwood land, abandoned to farming. But Petra Dark, of Reading, University's work challenges this. While some areas saw an increase in woodland at many sites, including Hadrian's Wall, the land continued to be farmed in exactly the same way. In some places, land use even intensified. Dark's work demolishes the vision of Britain reverting to a wildwood. In forts like Burdoswald and towns like Wroxeter, the end of Roman administration did not bring about the breakdown of society. Released from Rome's controlling hand, new leaders emerged, and society regrouped. Global connections. Tintagel and the Mediterranean trade. This new independence did not mean Britain had cut herself off from the rest of the world. A series of extraordinary contacts were about to be made with some of the most powerful players in the ancient world. On the rugged promontory of Tintagel in Cornwall, a dramatic site long associated with King Arthur the Dark Age story, is far more exciting. Excavations have shed new light on Britain's ancient contacts with the rest of the world. While the dramatic ruins of the castle are 13th century modern archaeology, found the remains of a large settlement dating to the middle of the Dark Ages. Thousands of shards of intriguing pottery were unearthed, none of it Roman, none of it conceivably produced in post-Roman Britain. Archaeologists suspected a Mediterranean origin. David Williams at Southampton University confirmed it through thin section analysis. The Tintagel pottery was made in enormous kiln sites in southern Turkey. These thick, sturdy vessels were made for sea transport, carrying olive oil and wine across the Mediterranean. Ships visiting Tintagel may have started in Turkey, picked up more cargo in the Peloponnese, then Carthage, and finally sailed through the straits to Britain. These Coca-Cola tins of their period, turning up at Tintagel, indicate Britain was at the edge of a vast trade network, driven by Constantinople, the new powerhouse of the ancient world, after Rome's sack in 410. But what did Britain offer these Mediterranean traders? A discovery in Devon in 1995 provided a clue. Divers found pure tin ingots, known to the Romans as the British metal. Was this what Byzantine traders were coming to collect from Tintagel? The tin, a British export since prehistoric times, would have been highly exchangeable for Mediterranean goodies. A few meters from where the tin was found, coastal erosion revealed hearths where meat had been cooked. Sam Turner, excavating the site, found butchered bone, suggesting seasonal settlements associated with trading. Along this coastline alone, 500 pottery shards and 10 feasting sites have been found, the remains of beach parties held during visits from Mediterranean traders. These festivities suggest more than simple commercial exchange. They indicate a deeper ceremonial exchange of beliefs and ideas. Some archaeologists even believe these ceremonies were politically driven. In the 6th century, Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, attempting to reconquer the Western Roman Empire, initiated a diplomatic charm offensive to bring local elites across Western Europe on board. Western Britain, with its existing elites, could have been part of this. The trade networks between Britain and Byzantium provided a conduit for spiritual and intellectual ideas. The Byzantine merchants did not sail halfway across the known world to visit a deteriorating island. They came to an economically independent country whose people had goods and ideas to share. The rise of literacy and a new European identity. There was one more step in the pottery story that would reveal the hidden words of a Dark Age civilization. A single shard of Mediterranean pottery, identical to the Tintagel material, was found on the remote island of Caldy off the south coast of Wales. Caldy, a holy island for centuries, still houses a monastery. Jonathan Wooding explained that these Eastern ceramics represent a period when the East was interested in the West sending trade and diplomatic missions. They expected to find people who were essentially like them, descendants of Romans sharing language rituals and cultural ideas. Caldi was part of the early monastic movement that arrived in Britain with the pottery on boats from the Mediterranean. The monastic movement, emerging with the departure of Roman rule, provided a new leadership and focus in a changing society. People embraced it with enthusiasm, an alternative to the more settled urban Christianity of the Roman world. Dozens of monasteries sprang up in Dark Age Britain, producing a new class of learned monks. One historical source for Dark Age Britain, written by the monk Gildas in the 6th century, about 100 years after the Romans left, is an extraordinary, eloquent account of this country's history. Written in high-grade, flowery Latin, peppered with classical references, it was clearly intended for a sophisticated, literate audience. Gildas was the preeminent theologian of monasticism in his era known across Western Europe. This suggests a learned world closely connected with a wider intellectual and religious community. He certainly wasn't a unique figure. He's unique in our records, which tells us more about our records than about the time. Gildas and men like him were not isolated monks, but scholars in touch with the intellectual and religious ideas of their time. We see a Britain in contact with the rest of the world, a normal process of exchange, not just an isolated missionary. Finds from places like Tintagel and Bantham, on a scale that makes it unlikely there were just one or two ships, are continually surfacing, giving us a clearer picture of the importance of these contacts. Archaeology has truly revealed something history simply didn't know before. Literacy was not confined to the monastic elite. Caldi Island yielded one more secret and ancient stone inscribed in Latin with the sign of the cross. I ask from all those walking there that they pray for the soul from within of Cadogan. This is rhythmic, syllabic, Adonic verse, by centuries the oldest. These people were using the meters that became the standard fare of every subsequent European literature. This was not a dark age. It was not illiterate. Stones like the one in Caldi scattered across Western Britain provide clear evidence for a highly literate society in Dark Age Britain. These are memorials written not by kings or priests, but by ordinary people, committing their thoughts to stone. For centuries, these inscriptions have been dismissed as clumsy scrawling of a semi-literate society. In actual fact, they offer unique insight into the ideas structuring early British thought. David Howlett, editor of the Latin Medieval Dictionary in Oxford, has deciphered these ancient messages. The structures that still shape learning today, the 7 liberal arts, the human constructs of language, and the divine hard sciences, were first formulated in the Dark Ages. Howlett believes this was a cooperation, a combination of human arts with divine mathematical art. You need both. You cannot have one without the other. During the 6th century, modern Europe was invented, and it was invented here in Britain. We find highly polished rhetorical Latinity from Gildas 130 years after the legion's departure, and these stone inscriptions. The inscriptions, once thought of as crude Latin prose, are in fact verse. "Dumpty, Dumpty, Dumpty," says Howlett. Once you read them aloud, they transform your view of what you're reading, and even more seriously, your view of the society from which this emerged. Some even contain hidden layers of meaning, like a name designed to be read backward. These thousands of Dark Age inscriptions imply a large number of readers even on remote hillsides. These islands became the focus for the real survival of Latin. The Britons were the only people in Europe who carried on writing very high-level literary Latin after the legions departed. Because they did not speak a Romance mother tongue, there was less linguistic interference, so they learned Latin by the book. Like Salman Rushdie learning English by the book and writing high-level literary language. "Are we looking at a renaissance here?" I asked. "For a renaissance to occur, you have to have a dark age, and I don't think the dark age ever existed," Howlett replied. "What I see is continuity in the intellectual life. The fall of Rome in 410 was a finite, catastrophic, historical moment for the empire, but it was the only place in which the lights were turned up brighter." The Anglo-Saxon myth, reshaping our identity. Not only had Britain survived the Roman withdrawal, refashioning towns and resurrecting trade links, she had begun to lay the foundation for an intellectually exciting future. I began this journey with the mythical figure of Arthur, looming in the background, a reminder of the lack of real evidence for the Dark Ages. I ended it believing I'd found my Camelot. This period gave birth to myths and legends as magical as Arthur, because it truly was an extraordinarily creative time. Arthur may be historical fiction, but he is placed in a real historical situation to crystallize it. This imagined golden age had a real solid foundation, and that's Camelot. My belief, for what it's worth, is that there was an Arthur, a local war leader, probably in the north of Britain. He could have been one of many strong leaders in this turbulent society. A tough soldier on Hadrian's Wall, a sophisticated Romanized Briton, restructuring towns like Wroxeter, a successful merchant with Mediterranean links, or part of the monastic elite. In looking for Arthur, I found a world far more exciting and real than any romantic tale of knights in shining armor. These were the real men and women of Arthur's Britain. But this world could not last forever. Wroxeter, where archaeologists found remarkable evidence for Dark Age survival, eventually collapsed. By the 7th century, a pagan ruler named Penda overwhelmed the town. If an Arthur was ever needed, it was then, but he wasn't there. These fantastic early Welsh poems, talking about Arthur-like figures, speak of this period with a sense of, if only there was someone who could come and help us. Arthur, in this context, becomes a wish, a nostalgia for a past that never actually happened. Whether or not they had an Arthur to protect them, the inhabitants of Wroxeter abandoned their town in the 7th century. Changes that had been happening elsewhere in Britain finally overtook them, a revolutionary tide coming not from the hills of Wales, but from the flat, fertile plains of eastern England. The end of Roxeter was the beginning of a new chapter, the Anglo-Saxon invasions. Next, I'll show how archaeologists are beginning to question whether even this celebrated event really happened. The conventional story of England's making describes Britain's sinking into lethargy after the Romans left only to be revived by a massive infusion of Anglo-Saxon blood from across the North Sea. These robust tribesmen, arriving in boats along the eastern shores, supposedly created a brave new world where dark forests were cleared and England was born. The problem there is no archaeological evidence for the Anglo-Saxon invasion. The traditional story of England's making is completely wrong. The real story will reshape our future and rewrite our past, unveiling the truth. The non-invasion. As an island people, we Brits have been obsessed with the idea of invasion, and the story of the Anglo-Saxon arrival has long been accepted as part of our history. But I'm going to show that the myth of the Anglo-Saxon invasion is just a tale. Leading-edge archaeology is re-examining the dramatic changes that took place in this country in the centuries after the Roman troops departed, and a very different story is emerging. Just before World War II, archaeologists in Suffolk uncovered one of the greatest discoveries of our time, the Anglo-Saxon burial mounds at Sutton Hoo. Helen Geeka explains how a landowner's request to investigate mounds led to the discovery of an intact ship burial, a fabulous, extraordinary archaeological treasure. This was the grave of a very rich man adorned with a helmet, a scepter-like whetstone, and a cup. While some see strong Swedish or Byzantine influences, others argue he tried to incorporate a bit of everything to portray himself as an important ruler of the East Angles. By the 7th century, parts of Britain had become a series of powerful kingdoms, later known as England. Did a boatload of Anglo-Saxon royalty sail up the Deben and establish their kingdom? The origin myths recorded by people like Bede suggest this, but we lack archaeological evidence. It seems far more likely that kings arose through internal social development in the late 6th century, and then created these origin myths to legitimize their rule, perhaps by claiming divine descent. Sutton Hoo is the most elaborate of many rich Anglo-Saxon burials in southern and eastern Britain. Archaeologists are divided on the origins of these powerful new leaders. Heinrich Herke favors the invasion idea, arguing that the distinctive Anglo-Saxon burials demonstrate a new dominant population. But I believe you don't need migrations to explain cultural change. If you look at post-Soviet Russia, you see a huge cultural shift not brought in by Western immigrants. While we can't trace them across the North Sea, the absence of widespread evidence for violent conflict is telling. If people moved onto land, there would be resistance. If there was population decline after the collapse of Roman civilization, there would be more space. But I don't believe there was a hole in British society. Without Roman taxes, people likely became more prosperous. Whenever archaeologists can't explain social change, they reach for the new people invasion explanation, but there's no actual evidence to support this. Science, however, is trying. Mark Thomas. a professor of genetics at University College London, and his team conducted a DNA survey of the British Isles, focusing on the male Y chromosome, which is passed largely unchanged from father to son. They found an unusually high similarity between DNA from Britain and parts of Holland. Within England, all towns looked very similar, but different to Welsh towns, and strikingly similar to Frisians. They concluded that a mass migration between 50 and 100% replacement must have occurred in the last 500 years, or more recently, if less complete. If this was the Anglo-Saxon migration, it implied a population replacement of between 50% and 100%. 3 million people shoved out, I asked. They don't show that, he replied. They couldn't say how it happened, pushing slaughtering or more benign economic differences. However, another team of geneticists in the same department came up with very different results, concluding that the native British Y chromosome has not been largely replaced in southern and eastern England. Furthermore, they couldn't distinguish between the genetic influence of the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. I'm suspicious of relying solely on genetic versions of history, especially when similar studies produce such different results. I'm also wary of simple explanations for complex times. The dramatic changes in the 5th and 6th centuries laid the foundations for our modern identity. But I'm going to show these changes were not the result of mass invasions. The untouched landscape and cultural shifts. On the south coast of Hampshire, at the entrance to a natural harbor, lies one of Britain's best-preserved Roman buildings, Portchester Castle. It's one of a series of coastal forts built by the Romans in the 3rd and 4th centuries, known as Saxon shore forts. Because it's widely accepted, they were built to keep out marauding Anglo-Saxon bands. But they may have been used for a very different purpose. 11 shore forts skirt the southern and eastern coast. Andrew Pearson, re-examining the forts, has surprisingly concluded they may have nothing to do with Anglo-Saxons. The traditional view of these sites as defenses against pirate raiders from Saxony, Frisia, and Jutland comes from a 16th century translation of a Roman military list. But what Saxon refers to is unclear. Pearson believes the huge walls are better suited to protecting goods inside the forts rather than attacking enemies from outside. If Saxons raided, it wasn't monthly, maybe not even yearly. These forts likely had a major economic or supply role, shipping materials and goods outwards into the empire. Pearson has found no archaeological evidence that these forts were built to defend against an Anglo-Saxon invasion. So, what is the evidence for invasion? The Yorkshire Wolds, the last of a series of chalk downs, were supposedly settled by Anglo-Saxon invaders 500 years ago. Here, one of the most extraordinary archaeological investigations is being carried out. 30 years ago, archaeologist Dominic Powlesland was asked to excavate some 5th century burials. He has since conducted one of the largest archaeological surveys in the world, scrutinizing every inch of the landscape for traces of its ancient past. Such a comprehensive survey should confirm the conventional view of invasion, but it didn't. Dominic discovered miles of farms and villages, a ladder settlement, that began 4,000 years ago and continued through the 8th century spanning the crucial Anglo-Saxon invasion period. This new archaeology is dedicated to understanding the long-term life and meaning of an entire landscape. His team has walked further than from Land's End to John O'Groats across these fields. Using a fluxgate gradiometer which measures minute variations in magnetic signal under the soil, they've built up a picture of buried features revealing undisturbed land where human activity once thrived. This is archaeological gold dust, well-preserved remains under a thick layer of wind-blown sand that protected them from modern plows. Dominic's excavations revealed the ghostly patterns of the geophysics survey. The actual remains of houses, trackways, and settlements spanning 4,000 years of ancient history. They found an Anglo-Saxon village, 49 acres, much bigger than the present village, and a cemetery. His meticulous surveys would have picked up the massive disruption an invasion causes, but all he found was evidence of peaceful and continuous settlement. No gaps in occupation, no war cemeteries, no dramatic changes in village layout. In short, no invasion. It's a continuously evolving and cared-for landscape, he says. We see Roman sites with Anglo-Saxon components. We see Roman activity underneath the Anglo-Saxon settlement. There is no gap between the two. What there was, however, was a change in fashion. Clothes, pottery, weapons, and burial practices underwent a dramatic shift after the Roman government collapsed. These new fashions were very similar to styles found on the continent. For decades, these burials have been taken as key evidence of a new people taking over. But what were invading Anglo-Saxons doing in Dominic's peaceful landscape? Could it be they weren't actually invading? Dominic sent some skeletons from his Anglo-Saxon cemetery to Paul Budd at Durham University, who pioneered stable isotope analysis. By measuring oxygen isotopes in tooth enamel, which forms in childhood and isn't remodeled, he can tell what climate and part of the world a person was born in. This offers the opportunity to identify first-generation immigrants. Of 24 bodies analyzed, a few were indeed foreigners, but the surprising result was that these 4 individuals, all females, had very poorly furnished graves, suggesting lower status. The most likely candidates were from Scandinavia or Norway, not continental warriors. The remainder of the population, half, were local to West Heslerton, and the other half were associated with the western side of the country. Early East Yorkshire seems to be occupied by a large proportion of Cumbrians, as far as I can tell, Budd remarked. So the foreign bodies were not continental warriors, but visitors or economic migrants. The results didn't surprise Dominic. A small number of newcomers, yes, but the majority of the population was exactly the same. Historians tell us that Anglo-Saxon invaders came to a society severely weakened by the collapse of Roman rule. But Dominic's vast excavation found no such evidence. People are coming in to appreciate the picture that we've thought was genuine for so long is seriously flawed, he says. And our population, we can prove, includes 1 or 2 people that come from Scandinavia, but this isn't an invasion. The birth of English identity. A cultural blending. If this change wasn't the result of invasion, what was going on? Profound cultural changes occurred in the 5th century. perhaps the most significant being language. Spoken language undoubtedly shifted from native British Celtic to English, a descendant of Germanic. Surely this, if anything, has to be proof of the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Modern linguistics, however, are questioning this assumption. Katie Lowe has been looking at traces of native British grammar in modern English. It's been accepted that Celtic languages didn't affect modern English, and I think that's basically stopped people looking. But linguists have discovered a hidden code in our language structure that shows a strong influence from the Britons. If a Celt learned Old English, they would make mistakes just like any second language acquisition reflecting the structure of their own language. Old English was structurally similar to German, relying on word endings to indicate meaning. Modern English, however, is all about word order. The cat chased the man versus the man chased the cat. This strange mutation seems to have come from the Celtic languages, indicating a contact over generations. The rise of English in these islands didn't come from a tidal wave of invaders, but from a prolonged period of contact, during which the native Britons chose to adopt a new way of speaking. But why archaeologist Sam Lucy, examining graves from the period, offers a clue. At the end of the Roman period, objects found in burials changed not necessarily due to migration, but to a shift in dress furnishings and grave goods. Women, for example, were buried with a much greater variety of dress furnishings, like a cruciform brooch, a cross-shaped brooch that, while its idea came from the continent, was a British product. The people living in Britain were aligning themselves more to a continental style and ideas. The mistake has been to take cultural artifacts as evidence of racial origin. If I wear American jeans, that doesn't make me an American. There's no doubt a trickle of warriors and families came into Britain from Northern Europe. But the traditional picture of invasion and population replacement is unsustainable. The people of Britain learned a new language, adopted new fashions, and shifted their political allegiances because they knew from experience this was the best way to keep up with rapidly changing times. It was only in later centuries that the complex details of this process were transformed into a captivating story, the enduring legacy of our diverse past. In 731, a Tyneside monk named the Venerable Bede finished his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which still forms the basis of modern history lessons. But Bede, like all historians, had his own agenda. According to Bede, the origins of the Church in England lay in 6th century Rome, where Pope Gregory the Great spotted beautiful, fair-haired slaves from pagan Britain. He famously replied that they looked more like angels. Bede portrays Britain as populated by heathen unbelievers, the Anglo-Saxons, and their conversion as a glorious achievement. In creating this story, Bede gave the Church a fresh start, depicting the newly converted Anglo-Saxon English as proper Christians, unconnected to the murky Celtic Christianity of the native Britons. But Bede was writing 200-300 years after the events, aiming for a coherent, tedious narrative. In fact, Christianity was already prevalent by the late Roman period. When Augustine arrived by invitation in the late 6th century, he found an island with existing Christians, bishops, and an organized church life. So there were different streams of Christianity. The conventional wisdom that Anglo-Saxons brought paganism and Christianity was only introduced in 597 is to me unbelievable. The British Church survived intact and was flourishing. The missionaries, expecting to find barbarian Ruritania instead, found a completely self-possessed church, whose sophisticated priests were capable of writing classical prose and verse than the Roman missionaries. They were so dumbfounded they simply ignored it, to gloss over the messy origins of English Christianity. Bede invented a new race of people, the Anglo-Saxons, who came to be known as the English. Bede's agenda was to present the Anglo-Saxons as a coherent body predestined to inherit southern Britain, much like the children of Israel inherited the Holy Land. And they inherited it from the British, according to Bede, because the British were unfit to live here. Thus, the English became a chosen people. Bede's influence is all the more extraordinary when you realize he never ventured outside his monastery. By inventing England, he laid the groundwork for an English identity, but this version doesn't represent who we are as a nation. My journey into the story of Britain A.D. has uncovered a very different picture, whether we hark back to Arthur or the Anglo-Saxons. We Brits have always used history to create a national identity, often based on an imagined past. When the Victorians decorated the House of Lords, they chose King Arthur, forcing him into an Anglo-Saxon mold to fit their ideals of a pure Teutonic stock. The result was a ludicrous conflation of two very separate aspects of our national identity. British identity just wasn't that simple. In the 19th century, Celtic historians were doing the same for the Welsh, Irish, and Scottish, in direct opposition to the Anglo-Saxon historians. This was deliberate manipulation of historical sources and archaeology to create a sense of history. The early centuries of Britain A.D. were formative years in the making of this country's identity, not just for Britain, but across Europe. We almost invariably look to the early Middle Ages to find our roots, the period that removed a common culture and created smaller units to which we can now look and say, "This is where I'm coming from." Our ancestors were not brave Anglo-Saxon supermen, nor mysterious Celtic warriors like Arthur. These origin myths, tying us to one pure race or another, do not do justice to our culture. We were not a weak and disorganized society overpowered by the Romans, nor did we dissolve into chaos when they left. We did not suffer a period of dark age confusion, and we never needed to be saved by the tribesmen of Anglo-Saxon legend. The real people of Britain A.D. not only survived an influx of foreign influences, but actually flourished because of them. We absorbed Roman and later Byzantine and North European culture without losing a sense of our own identity. This ability to absorb and adapt this creative plagiarism has always been at the heart of British identity. This diversity is not just a feature of our distant past. It's a trait that can still be seen in every aspect of our life, even our food. Robin Cook, former British Foreign Secretary, famously selected chicken tikka masala as Britain's national dish. Our national identity itself is a result of a blending of countless inputs over centuries of different ethnic groups who have settled here, made their contribution, and become part of the resultant mix. What makes Britain great, what makes us strong is not purity, it is diversity. It's all those many different influences that have shaped our language, our history, our culture, and our character. As we stride into the 21st century, with the confidence of our Victorian ancestors, we must keep an eye on the past. Because if we discard our sense of history, we'll be like people with no memory, who don't know who they are. To find the true origins of Britain A.D., I have had to look beyond the headline-grabbing figures, the Romans, King Arthur, and the Anglo-Saxons, and instead I've turned to the real heroes of these lands, the ordinary Britons in their millions who invented our diverse and resilient culture.